Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 398th New Social Environment. I'm Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation on Bruce Conner and Jay Defeo, featuring esteemed curators Rachel Fetterman, Laura Hoptman, Stuart Comer, and Constance Lewallen. We're thrilled to have the Rail's very own poetry editor, Anselm Berrigan, here today, who will close to read our program. And here at the Rail, we have opened all of our events with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. The heart of both of these acknowledgements is a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and solidarity for all who struggle for freedom and recognition that when it comes to liberation, our histories never unfold in isolation, as said by Angela Davis. In that spirit, I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions that we will post in just a moment. And now to introduce today's host, Constance Lewallen is adjunct curator at the UC Berkeley Art Museum, where she organized many major touring exhibitions. She is well positioned to moderate this panel on Jay Defeo and Bruce Conner today in coordination with the exhibition at Paula Cooper Gallery. In 1986 to 1987, she curated an exhibition of Bruce Conner's Angels and related drawings as part of the Berkeley Art Museum's Matrix program. In 1996 to 1997, she curated the first museum survey of Defeo's work for the Goldie Paley Gallery, Moore College of Art and Design in Philadelphia. Titled Jay Defeo Selected Works, 1952 to 1989, the exhibition traveled to the UC Berkeley Art Museum. It won the ICA Award for Best Show in a Nonprofit Space. She is also a beloved editor-at-large here at the Rail. And without further ado, Connie, over to you.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thanks for all the work you've done in getting this organized. And thank you, Fang Gui, and thank you to the Rail. I can't even imagine how you manage to do this every day of the week, but it's pretty impressive. I'm going to introduce our three panelists, who will then start our discussion about this wonderful show. First up will be Rachel Fetterman, Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Drawings at the Morgan Library and Museum. Before joining the Morgan in 2016, she was Assistant Curator of Painting and Sculpture at SF MoMA, where she helped organize the retrospective Bruce Conner, It's All True. Her current exhibition is Another Tradition, Drawings by Black Artists from the American South. Next up will be Laura Hoptman, who is Executive Director of the Drawing Center, a post she has held since 2018. She's been Curator of Contemporary Art and a leading participant in the international art conversation for 3 decades. She came to the Drawing Center after 8 years as curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at MoMA in New York, with a specialty in drawing. There she curated dozens of exhibitions. And lastly, Curator Stuart Comer is the Lonnie Ebers Chief Curator of Media and Performance at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. He also leads the Marie-Josée and Henry Kravis studio, the museum's new space dedicated to performance, music, sound, spoken word, and expanded approaches to the moving image. He organized the exhibition Bruce Conner, It's All True, 2016, as well as many others, including the current Adam Pendleton, who is Queen, a major commission currently on view at MoMA, and is co-curating the forthcoming exhibition Signals, the Politics of Video. The occasion for this discussion is the groundbreaking exhibition at the Paula Cooper Gallery that features works by Bruce Conner and Jay Defeo, the first to examine their unique artistic relationship. It will be on view until October 23rd. Gallery visitors first encounter works by both artists. We can do the slides now, Nick, I guess you are. That precede their related drawings, photos, and collages. The 3 Conner assemblages were made in the 1950s. One is titled Homage to Jean Harlow. Conner also dedicated one to Jay Defeo that is not in this exhibition. Conner's assemblages were in part inspired by seeing Defeo's wrapped Christmas presents hanging from the ceiling in her apartment. Across the hall is a small gallery featuring Defeo's 4x8-foot 1958 pencil drawing titled The Eyes, which are based on a photograph of her own eyes, with a poem by Philip Lamantia on the back. She'd never done anything like this before. She said this haunting image came to her in a dream. On an adjacent wall are 1970s drawings based on her swim goggles. In one case, she shows the eyes looking through the lenses, a reverse view of the drawing, the eyes. The eyes also figure in several of Conner's 70s series, The Late Night Movie, which you see here. Rachel, whose essay is featured in the gallery exhibition, is going to start us off today. So I'm handing it over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Connie. And I want to say a quick thanks to Steve Henry, Daisy Charles, who organized this beautiful show at Paula Cooper Gallery. And thanks for inviting me to write the essay and to have the opportunity to contemplate this incredible relationship between Bruce Conner and Jay Defeo. And Nick, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, thanks. Bruce Conner and Jay Defeo first met in 1957 when Conner relocated with his wife Jean to San Francisco. And as Connie said, he was inspired to create his assemblages, which are some of his best known works to certain audiences, by the Christmas presents that she wrapped and hung from her ceiling. But I think that the larger context for that is really the way that Defeo's life and her art were just completely imbricated. And so as we'll see a little bit later, I think one of the things that attracted him the most to Defeo and to her very well-known painting, The Rose, was not just the object, the rose itself, but also the environment that surrounded it. And so what we're looking at now is a photograph Defeo took in 1973 in her studio in Marin County. And it's a candlestick telephone, and she's replaced the receiver with a light bulb. And so she's kind of playing on this idea of the candlestick telephone, which is this outmoded technology, by actually attaching a light bulb to it so that it can become a kind of form of illumination. And she photographs it within the context of other objects in her studio. And her studio practice is a very central component of her work. And I think that this is something that Conner always admired, and that he in some sense aspired to, and something that he tried to recreate in some of his exhibitions, where he was really trying to make the work of the studio visible to other people. And I think he never quite managed to do it in the way that Defeo did with this kind of work. And it was something that I think the two of them really connected over. Next slide, please. So as you can see in this collage by Defeo from just a couple of years after the photograph, she's taken that image of the candlestick, which was part of the telephone, and she's attached it to this reproduction of one of Bruce Conner's photograms that he called Angels. And there's a kind of intimate connection between the work and the relationship that they had, which is that they spoke on the phone very often, and Defeo affectionately called Conner telephone. And, I was thinking about this idea of the telephone as a kind of, sound at a distance, and that they had this kind of, they were only 20 miles apart. He was in San Francisco and she was in Marin, but they had this kind of interesting relationship of, the voice, connecting in this way through voice at a distance. And what Defeo did with this work and other works that we'll see is I think she sort of made a visual corollary to this kind of beautiful disembodied relationship that they had over the telephone that was so important to both of them. And so here you can see she's actually transforming this figure of Bruce Conner into the surrealist telephone that she made with this candlestick telephone and the light bulb. And of course, there's also the connection between the light of the photogram, the way it's created, the way that it appears to emanate a kind of light, and this image of the light bulb. Next slide, please. So here is the original photogram, which you can see in the Paula Cooper show. It's a life-size work. And, this was really an outgrowth of Conner's constant seeking. He and Defeo were both seekers, spiritual seekers. They were both really concerned with issues of identity. And, really, Conner and Defeo, I think both were very vulnerable in their work in terms of kind of revealing themselves and their own kind of seeking for meaning within their lives. And Conner, I think, came with this body of work, which is really incredibly beautiful and spiritual, to this realization of the body as pure light. So it's this kind of transcendent view of the self, kind of dematerialized. And I think that it makes an interesting contrast with Defeo's work. And there's a really wonderful discourse that their work has. And if you'll go to the next slide. So there's this series of collages related to the one we saw earlier with the light bulb, but a little bit different, where Defeo has taken all of these exhibition announcements with the photograms reproduced on them. And what she's done is she's actually filled them up, and she actually called the photograms vases. So she thought of them as vessels to be filled. And so I think, there's this kind of sense of disembodiment within these representations of the body. But Defeo's practice, I think, was much more organic and rooted in the sort of everyday life of the studio, in the objects that are surrounding her. And so by filling up these vessels with photographs of these objects, I think you have this incredible, it's almost a kind of a double portrait of Defeo and Conner. And I think this exhibition does a really beautiful job of illuminating this very special relationship that they had. And I'll pass it to Laura now.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Connie and Paul Gallery and the Brooklyn Rail for staging this wonderful show and this event. Just a little bit of a addendum to my biography. I was the co-curator with Stuart, Gary Garrels, Rachel, and film colleague, we have to mention his name, at SF MoMA.
Rudolph Freiling.
Thank you, sorry. Rudolph Freiling. We were a real large bunch of people who worked on that fantastic show, something I'll never forget. So thank you for letting me, inviting me to talk about the drawings of Bruce Conner in contrast and in comparison to Jay Defeo, because these are artists who were friends. They had similar interests. But those similar interests took them entirely different directions in their drawings. Although there's a lot of things that they have in common, you can see with this juxtaposition. And there's, albeit a 10-year difference between these two drawings, some of the most stark differences between the graphic work of Jay Defeo and Bruce Conner. I mean, most obviously Defeo's, much of her drawing illustrates what a wonderful draftsperson Jay Defeo was. Her work, many of her drawings are illusionistic. They take advantage of classical drawing activities like the use of chiaroscuro and others. They acknowledge space in a way that is classical, that is using the piece of paper as a window. This work has a kind of sketch-like quality, a naturally unfinished quality, but it also is spectre-like. And I like to think of it in a way as it's realistic in a way, but it's also has a kind of hallucinogenic quality, like Defeo is seeing something that we can't see and noting it down. Whereas Conner, and I'm giving you a look at a signature work, this 34 Carl Street, is really the mark making that for those who look at Conner's works on paper, this is really his signature mark, just as the net would be a signature mark for Kusama, for example. But you can see that it's repetitive, meditative. It's a simple activity multiplied many, many times to the point of obsession. It's an all-over composition as opposed to using the piece of paper as a window. It's close to a pattern, but it's not. There's no repetition in a way. There's a repetition of the way that Conner makes the marks, but the marks themselves are handmade, so they're necessarily different. What it all adds up to is a kind of anti-illusion. You can see the pattern, but we're not, I would argue that we're not looking at space here. It's also very finished as opposed to the non-finito of the Defeo. Conner's attention to detail and the repetitive meditative process that he uses to make a drawing like this is spiritual, if you will. And some have argued that it's even incantatory. That is something that might put you in a trance. But it's important to understand that it's also fueled by endurance. That's maybe an obvious thing, but it's important at this moment in the history of American art, in the 60s and the 70s, where process becomes so much part of the subject of the work. If Jay Defeo's drawing, like reverse water goggles, is in a way hallucinogenic, if Defeo is, say, and this is not saying that she did it, but she ate it, but if Defeo is closer to a kind of LSD experience, Conner's drawing at 34 Carl Street and others is more like speed. Can I have the next? So in many of his best known works, Conner concentrated on a form that can be considered mandala-like, or in this case, a modified mandala. This well-known work that's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, 23 Kenwood Avenue. You can see in the center of these two frame-like areas a circle. So it is considered, and when we did the exhibition, we hung this work with the other mandalas. So it's an example of that incantatory process that creates an object that is, in a way, a bit talismanic. So I mentioned that this mark that he's making with these rapidograph pens is personal to Conner. That is a kind of signature, but he's taken personal expression out of the repetitive marks as much as he can, even though he's doing this by hand. Whereas Defeo, of course, is using, in this incredible drawing, uses this expressionistic mark making with a great economy to get across what she's trying to do. It's a perfect example of a kind of quickness, kind of movement that's very evident in a lot of her drawings, whereas the notion of the static slowness is something that Conner's all over drawings with this particular pattern is definitely evident. I want to mention this notion of the talisman. Of course, a mandala is something that you use in your spiritual life. There's a talismanic quality to Defeo's work in general. And with this drawing in particular, it in a way is a kind of bone, but which looks to me, I interpret it as in a way, a ritual object. But whereas Defeo is depicting an object that might be, say, have some sort of spiritual expanded landscape quality, Bruce Conner's is embedded, that quality is embedded in the process itself. Can I have the next one? Speaking of processes, even when the processes are similar, and this example is of xerography, and the show Paul Cooper does a really good job in noting, in a way, that this language of using the Xerox machine in the late 1960s and all throughout the 70s was enormously important. Both Conner and Defeo, by the way, might have been at a remove, if you will, from the larger New York art world, the art discourse, on purpose. But this doesn't mean, and especially in Conner's case, that he wasn't looking extremely carefully at what was, as it were, going on. But in this case, as in the cases before that I've showed you, they both use xerography in a very, very different way with very different results. With Defeo, again, depicting this world that is not our own. It's this other world that we look into when we go into the paper. And whereas Conner is creating a drawing or collage, which in itself is an actual object. Just as Conner, as I said, Conner was very involved with the art world, at least in the Observer, in an observer way. And I wanted to say that there's an interesting phenomenon throughout his career, because both Defeo and Conner used many different mediums while they were during their lifetimes. And Conner particularly would sort of work in a way in chapters. He might go back to certain things, but with the example of the assemblages, it was just in 1964, just when his assemblages were reaching a kind of apex and really penetrating into the contemporary art discourse, he stopped making them. And one of the reasons he gave for that was that the style had become ubiquitous. Interestingly, though, he seems to have continued to use his language, his drawing languages, that sort of doodle-like black and white patterns, as well as the cut and pasted papers that we're going to see in a minute throughout his career in fits and starts. Can I have the next two? So I guess the apex of Conner's obsession with process and paper are with this series of Rorschach or ink blots that he created and then mastered until the end of his life. He especially worked with this medium when his movements began becoming curtailed because of an illness that he suffered with, a chronic illness till the end of his life that made it, it slowed him down, made it difficult for him to move around. One of the reasons why I made this wonderful juxtaposition between these two works is that I wanted to point out that I had mentioned earlier that the mark that he was making, that sort of doodle-like mark, was a kind of identity, a mark of identity for Conner. But it's important to know that throughout his career, he played with the notion of hiding his identity. In fact, over a short period of time later in his career, he even worked under the pseudonym Anonymous. And a lot of his processes culminating with this, the ink blots that have an element of chance, although it would be what Marcel Duchamp called can chance. That is, that he was closely monitored and directed by Conner and the processes that he created to make this. He is trying to obliterate the artist's hand. Defeo also played with many different languages and works on paper, and this is an example given the one that we saw before, but her identity and her choices are always present. And this is a huge difference, a gulf, if you will, between Defeo's works on paper and Bruce Conner's works on paper. Let me have the last slide. There's no doubt that both of these great artists lived off one another, inspired one another. That is, their creativities were mutually inspiring, and they were close in their discussions and also in sharing what they were thinking about and what they were doing. The Rose was the spur. This is a good introduction to Stuart for one of Conner's greatest works, the film The White Rose. And Conner's Angels, of course, engendered that series of photo collages that Rachel showed us and that are in the Paula Cooper show. But in the end, it's important to remember that these were very different kinds of artists, shared intellectual interests, a shared curiosity, and a fascination with the everyday, the macabre, the homely, and the low. And I think that this is, in a way, a good lesson for all of us who are looking at art, and especially contemporary art over the past 30, 40, 50 years, that we tend to latch on to the notion of the monolithic, that people coming from San Francisco who started working in the late 1950s worked like this. But in fact, it's a much richer way of looking at things when you look at the intellectual content, when you look at the ideas that are engendering this wonderful work by artists, rather than trying to look for formal comparisons amongst the work themselves, because it's not going to necessarily reveal how close the artists are, even though they were working together or living together or falling in love, or some of the other things that we look at when we look at the history of art through a purely historical lens. Stuart?
Thank you, Laura, and thanks to Nick and everybody following at the Brooklyn Rail for bringing us all together. I am absolutely delighted to be back in dialogue with Laura and Rachel. And sorry that Gary and Rudolph can't be here, but I miss our team and I miss that show. I'm so thrilled to be in dialogue with Connie too, who's done such important work over the years on Bruce and his circle. And I also just wanted to shout out to Dana Miller, whose fabulous show on Jay Defeo at the Whitney really changed how I understood her work. And I know at the time she was really determined to ensure that Jay was established on her own terms, not always in dialogue with the men within that particular scene. And I think she succeeded. But that said, I think it's also urgent to go back to looking at the meaningful dialogues she had with Bruce in particular. Next slide, please. One more. And one more, sorry. And one more, sorry, we're almost there. Okay, there we go, thank you. So this is an installation shot from the gorgeous show at Paula Cooper. And again, kudos to Steve and everybody there for this extremely well installed and beautiful deep dive into this conversation between two great artists. I also wanted to give another shout out to Michelle Silva from the Bruce Conner Family Trust. And if we can have the next video, in fact, I just wanted to quickly show you how heroic the work she's done on preserving Bruce's films has now played out with her most recent restoration of The White Rose. It really is a tribute to how she has changed the game of film preservation. So I don't have time to go into a detailed technical analysis, but I hope that Michelle might be able to publish in some detail the process by which she really painstakingly restores the films. I would refer all of you to an Artforum article in which she and Ross Lippman sort of detailed the process of the restoration of Bruce's film Crossroads and how they effectively were digitizing the film frame by frame, sort of fusing an analog process with a digital process. But I think this kind of dialogue between an analog past and a digital future somehow weirdly speaks to this exhibition and the dialogue between the very material elements of something like the rose, the White Rose, which you can see, I believe, still in the Whitney's collection displays, and then the more immaterial ways of capturing it in Bruce's film. But similarly, as with Bruce, I mean, the White Rose itself has been such a monumental conservation challenge and achievement on the Whitney's part. We had similar challenges here at MoMA and with other works that were included in Bruce Conner's All True. So whether it's assemblage or cinema, we're dealing with extremely fragile art forms. And so there's been a lot of heroic attention given to how to preserve them and how we might think about how they even change the logic of preservation in museums and what roles we might play in making sure these works remain in the conversation. Next slide, please. So here are just a few stills from the White Rose, but what I love about this image is it also, I think, really helps us understand something that Rachel in her catalog, one of her many essays for the It's All True catalog, really detailed Bruce's interest in environments. He was not only interested in the object, and he sort of took this Duchampian history of the ready-made and then really took an understanding of a discrete object or an assemblage and really wanted to explode it into experiential environments. This is true of his films too. A movie, which was the first work we included in the show, really was not only meant to be a film that you would see in a cinema or in a conventional setting, but rather in a dazzling environment where there would be lights and sound and all kinds of things going on. So it was really seen as an immersive total experience, not only a film. And I think that's partly what drew him to really become obsessed with not only the White Rose, but the studio itself and Jay's world and this kind of collapse of private and public and very personal. And what's so gorgeous in this film is how it keeps cutting back and forth between the street and between the interior, which is sort of penetrated by the windows. And you see Defeo herself, but also a lot of workers. If we can go to the next slide. Kind of coming in and out of the frame. Here you see her at rest, but if we go to the next slide. Here you see the incredibly hard work it took to really almost dismantle this studio and this building in order to excise the work and take it out to transport it, as Jay was effectively being forced to leave because of a rent increase. But again, like there's just this wonderful play between this 2,300-pound sculpture and then the lightness of the images. And there are these gorgeous moments where, you look up at Jay Defeo herself sitting on a fire escape, kind of kicking her heels. And you almost feel like you're levitating in the image, even though there's this incredibly cumbersome and difficult work going on. Next slide, please. I also just wanted to quickly mention other work by Bruce involving women, and not only in the film work. I mean, I think it's important to stress that one of his great early assemblages or collages, Untitled, while you see a sort of almost two-dimensional assemblage on the front surface, on the back surface was a large collage of sort of pinup girls in a giant grid of found images. And so it's been very easy for a lot of people to read him simply as a misogynist over the years. But I think what we learned during the making of It's All True is that there are more complex readings, and that his relationship with women were more complex. It was not a one-way address in many cases. And I think this exhibition really proves there was something really deep and meaningful going on in his dialogue with Jay Defeo. But similarly, here you have the wonderful film Vivian, which was from 1964, a little bit earlier. But in Vivian, there's also, I should just mention that, of course, Bruce is considered sort of the father of music videos. So like most of his films, the film is set to the tune of Conway Twitty's version of Mona Lisa, but it's also shot in the Batman Gallery, which was a sort of alternative space in which he was involved, where one early iteration, walls were painted on one side black and on one side white, so that they could kind of flip around and completely change the context of whatever you were looking at. But there was also a glass vitrine inside of the space, and in a few shots you see Vivian herself sort of entombed in this vitrine like an art object herself. But there are also moments where I do feel that, you know, Vivian has some agency in this film, which is an important thing to stress. Next slide, please. Breakaway is arguably one of Bruce's best known films, and here you see the great Toni Basil as she is literally breaking out to the song Breakaway. And what happens in this film effectively is, after a sequence in which she dances quite frenetically in the capture, it's almost as if she's sort of smeared across the screen, but then it reverses. And so you get halfway through and suddenly you're kind of rewound step by step back to the beginning. But again, this was very much a collaboration. I mean, I don't think, again, it was a one-way address in any way. And then next slide, please. Finally, in Cosmic Ray, this was one of his earliest films from '61, but amongst the barrage of images of pop culture and Mickey Mouse and a lot of other footage, you know, you do see this one important sequence where there is, again, this sort of pinup girl who Bruce invited into his studio to kind of film against a black velvet curtain, with a more conventional, perhaps, notion of the male artist and his female muse or model. Yet again, though, I don't know that it's that easy to read, but I just wanted to quickly read an excerpt from the catalog. We invited Dara Birnbaum, the great video artist, who herself is really a master of taking found material, but really interrogating the image of women. But she was really fascinated with Bruce's work, but also the role that all of the women I've just discussed played in it. And she just said that these films strongly resonate with me, and I consider this body of work a muse to be reckoned with. I find an almost obsessive need to question and penetrate Conner's relationship to the women he portrayed in each of these works. Perhaps this is a similar questioning, almost an irritation I had when I viewed television's Wonder Woman in 1978 and the Hollywood Squares in 1979. However, Conner's images of women suggest a more intimate relationship to his subject, not a deconstruction of, but an engagement with an enigmatic celluloid dream, desire unfulfilled, toyed with, teased with, danced with. Perhaps one could even see his portrayals as loves made existent through the safety of his lens, magnificently cut to a heartbeat, repeated and altered. Conner has consistently seems to objectify his desire to project it onto the women he was filming, or even at moments to transform those very images turned object into the abject. In Cosmic Ray, for example, quick takes of a new dancer reveal a human skull between her legs. And I think that the human skull, again, kind of brings us back to the mortality in the work and this sense of almost disappearance that comes up again and again in Bruce's work. Next slide, please. Here you see again Defeo herself sitting in the studio, really kind of pondering the existential weight of her greatest work being effectively removed. Next slide. And then we go back to the angels. And I think Rachel did such a beautiful job at discussing this. And I know we need to get to questions and conversations, so I'll keep it brief. But, you know, I think this remediation of an already beautiful series, The Angels, is really complicated in these beautiful photocopies. And again, taking the question of light as it had existed in the photograms as they were photographed by Edmund Shea, and then yet again, doubling down on the photocopy and this idea of the image being remediated through the passage of light, through the scan. Next slide, please. But, you know, again, in many works, Bruce really attempts to disappear. He changes his name, he uses pseudonyms, He's constantly kind of diverting any fixed identity. But I think he does a similar operation with his relationships with the women I've just discussed. And it's not always easy to grasp these relationships or exactly how they functioned or what meaning they had. So to have an opportunity like this exhibition to do a deep dive into this incredibly interesting dialogue between Bruce and Jay Defeo has been, for me, really productive. But I just wanted to end, this is a little bit of a tangent, but the final slide. Just again, as a tribute to Connie, but when the works were installed in Berkeley, Bruce insisted on painting the walls black and bringing in live crickets. So when we installed the work at MoMA in 2016, we were able to bring in recorded crickets. But again, it gets back to this idea of a living environment, a really magical, mystical, spiritual situation, rather than something that can only be reduced to a discrete object. And I think the same can be said of Bruce's relationships. It's never a simple binary. It's a much more complex set of relationships and dialogues that constantly shift shape and form as those conversations and relationships evolve. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Stuart. I just want to add a little bit to this last slide. Thank you for acknowledging the fact that I showed these as a group years and years ago. But Bruce Conner is famously known for being wanting to be in control of his work in all times, even after the work was in someone else's collection. But if one were to do, and many people tried to do shows of Bruce's and couldn't because they couldn't accept his terms. But when I did this little show, and it was a small show, I just said to Bruce, whatever you want, we'll do. And that was really the only way it could be done. And so it was simple: paint the walls black, spotlight the images, and have the live crickets. We did have live crickets. We couldn't do that today in the museum. It wouldn't be allowed, but these poor preparators had to run down and get cricket food every 2 or 3 days. I just want to say, to continue this conversation, Bruce and Jay were so different as individuals. I mean, so different as personalities. I mean, Bruce being very controlling and austere in a way, Jay being very outgoing and kind of funny and engaging with people easily. And yet they had this intense relationship. One only wishes one could have heard some of those conversations that seems went on for hours and hours. And I think it was Bruce, in fact, who encouraged Jay to begin photographing objects around her studio, which she did in the 70s following the completion of The Rose. So does anybody want to continue that thread, their relationship? And what made it so interesting? What did they find in each other that was so compelling that they would spend all this time in conversation, literal conversation?
I just wanted to add something to what you just said, which is, that when Defeo started doing photography in the early 1970s, it was following a really fallow period for her where she had not been doing any work at all, and she had not even had a studio for years. And I think part of what enabled her psychologically to begin making work again was Conner's assistance in seeing to the preservation of the rose, because I think that part of what was weighing on her was the sort of liminal state of the rose, and that it was falling into disrepair, and that it was sort of homeless. And Conner's assistance with that, just practical assistance, was actually what enabled her to begin her practice again. So that's another component of their relationship that I think is really amazing.
Yeah, and she, when she finished, when the rose was removed from her studio, and as you mentioned, there were the several years where she just didn't make any art. She was really recovering from that intense experience. But then she started doing drawings, and she had a very tiny studio at the time. It was merely a screen porch. And that was partly why she turned to drawing and photography and collage, because she could do those in this small space. She was very good at adapting to whatever the situation was in terms of making her art. But the rose finally, ended up at the Art Institute in San Francisco, where it was conserved over many, many, many months. And you could walk into the room where it was being conserved and just watch the process. And I did that on many occasions. It was sort of an amazing experience. And no one knew at the time if it was ever going to be conserved and it ever could be hung. But of course it has been and is. And not that it's easy. I mean, the back of the rose is like a whole structure that you wouldn't believe. But anyway, continuing on. What do you think is I mean, would you agree that a thread in their works that connect their works has to do with re-imaging and recycling of found objects and forms, even though these may be different? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. But I think that that makes them artists of their time as well, right? I mean, and I think that to a certain extent, Conner was more involved for a longer period of time with the found object than Defeo. Is that fair to say?
I think so.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, you know, Bruce Conner has many hats. I mean, some people only know him as a filmmaker,
Mhm.
and some people know his assemblages, but nothing else. And with Jay, she's always been a painter, drawer, you know. But he had this wide-ranging interests and approaches to things, and yet it's still it's very interesting that this relationship was never explored in a show before this. I mean, if you look at any of the catalogs of these artists that were shows in the past, nothing was ever mentioned about their collaborative work. It's only recently that people have come to understand it.
Connie, I think it's a key point you're asking, and that's kind of why I wanted to read the Dara Birnbaum quote too, because, you know, we talked a lot about this question of, you know, stealing an image rather than taking an object, but, you know, how the films do relate to the assemblages in many different ways. But then with Defeo too, you have this kind of call and response, especially with the Angel series and the photocopies, and it's not just taking or stealing an image, but I mean, there's real intention, I think, in that dialogue, specifically between the two of them and how they remediate one another's work. But it just feels like one of the absolutely essential operations for both of them on some level. But also there's still, and I love the drawing of the eyes that opens the show from the Lannan Foundation. And they were just such deep lookers, you know, like they really looked closely. And it's a very different type of, you know, appropriation than certainly the pictures generation, although there are many resonances between them. But I, you know, it's a different argument on some level.
Yes, and I mean, we also should mention that they were part of this very, very close-knit community. They lived either with or adjacent to one another on Fillmore Street. I think Bruce lived on Jackson Street, literally around the corner. So was Joan Brown and her husband, and Sonia Getchoff and Michael McClure and his wife. And so there was this literal community that went on for years until they were evicted, basically. And that's what the film is about. I mean, takes place at a time when they actually had to leave, and Jay goes off to Marin. But, and they both had relationships with the San Francisco Art Institute. Almost everybody did at a certain point. They both taught there, and actually it was Jay's teaching there that introduced her to the idea of making photographs. But she allowed photo students into her studio, and I mean, into her classes, and therefore became interested in that process as part of her own.
I wanted to also just mention quickly that at some point the White Rose had a subtitle, and I forget exactly what it was, but it was a reference to the Berrigan storage, or Berrigan's moving men as angels, you know, because they're wearing these white jumpsuits. And so I just wanted to mention that as another connection among some of the works in the exhibition, that Conner figured these you know, moving men as angels who were sort of, you know, lifting this you know, this work, this mandala out of the apartment and spiriting it away.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
I want to address a question that's come up on the chat that has to do with the relationship of the premise that maybe Defeo worked on the White Rose for a long period of time as a form of protest, if you will. I think that it's important to note the very special relationship that Conner and Defeo had, but also the special relationship within that milieu of artists, because they were away from the center. I think I'm quoting Joan Brown, I think she talked about this as well. There was a level of non-competition and collectivity that you didn't see in some other artist communities. And also a certain measure of hostility, if you will, to the idea of an outsider, whether it be a curator from the East Coast, like the curator who came from MoMA to do the art of assemblage in late 1961, or any others, to look at this group of artists and bring them together under one or two art historical labels, if you will. And that this lack of connectivity to that, and also the lack of connectivity to a commercial art world, allowed artists to do things like work on the rows for a forever period of time, or for Conner to jump from one thing to another, because the stakes were different for that group of artists in San Francisco. I think I defer to the San Franciscans, but it seems to me, as somebody who's been studying the New York art world after the Second World War, it was an entirely different place, a different kind of fertility, and it grew different plants.
I think that you're absolutely right. I worked with so many artists who, say, came from the Midwest, and they had to decide whether they were going to go to New York or to California. It was sort of one or the other. They would choose San Francisco because of that idea of being away from the commercial art world, being in a sort of a community. I mean, Bruce himself is an example of that. He left Kansas. He could have gone to New York. He considered it, but he didn't. He went to San Francisco. And then there's this story, which turned out not to be true, that Jay and Wally Hedrick, her then husband, were part of Dorothy Miller's 16 Americans, this amazing thing at MoMA, and that they were given tickets and they didn't even bother to go. But it turns out that Dana found out when she was doing the research that that really wasn't true. They were never offered tickets. But people didn't just hop on planes and just, go someplace in those days. They had no money, for one thing, or even if they had, it just wasn't something people did.
You just reminded me of that. There's a great anecdote about when William Seitz, who curated Art of Assemblage at MoMA in '61, first went to the Bay Area because he'd heard about, this assemblage artist community, and he wanted to meet them. And so Bruce was effectively hired to drive him around and introduce him to all the great and the good. And the first place that he took William Seitz was, in fact, a junk shop. And it was run by an elderly Black man who roughly, I don't know, maybe once a week would do a new assemblage in the window of the shop with all the junk that had recently arrived. This person did not end up in the exhibition, but I think it speaks to Bruce's desire somehow to also champion others, just as he champions Jay Defeo in this film, or in this dialogue. And I wouldn't call him necessarily like a born collaborator, but there is something there in that smaller community of him wanting to it's partly also his own disappearance in his own work, but there's something about how he did engage others in the work that I think is interesting.
And you did mention, and I want to emphasize, that the Angels were a collaborative project with the great photographer Edmund Shea, and Bruce always acknowledged that. So in some way, he was very generous in some ways. As difficult as he could be, he could also be extremely generous.
And then there were the other ways that he would invite collaboration, which has to do more with destruction of the work. So for example, when he gave Christine Stiles one of his ink drawings and instructed her to leave it in front of a window so that it would fade, which is also part of this great story about this painting that he made called Homage to Jay Defeo, which is disintegrating in a backyard in San Francisco. And just this idea of, mutability and change as an inevitable part of life. And I think that was something where he was able to involve other people, even if he was not a born collaborator in much of his work.
It's also the sort of anti-market quality, this militation against what was considered a certain kind of art and a certain kind of art world at the moment, that invited Conner early on, as well as Defeo and Joan Brown and several other people from San Francisco, but they each one of them refused in their own way to take part in that world that they felt was counter to what they were trying to do with their artwork.
You also think about the Rat Bastard Protective Association, or even the Batman Gallery, and these were collective situations. Like he did actually collaborate, but it's a complicated history.
Yeah,
it's true. I mean, sorry, Connie.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say he did collaborate on the design of the Batman Gallery, but of course he was having the first show, so there was a selfish motive there too.
Yeah, And well, you know, for a while, the New York beats came out to San Francisco too, you know, so there was Ginsburg, for example, and also Jack Kerouac. And so, yeah, there was that back and forth, but that was really before what we're talking about in this show. We're really concentrating on the 70s as opposed to, say, the 50s, when the beat scene was really at its peak.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what makes this show really special, is because the narrative of that group tends to fall off at the end of the 1960s, you know, around the time that the Roses removed from 2322 Fillmore, and that group sort of disbands and, you know, scatters a bit. And so I think this is a really actually beautiful homage to the continued relationships among these artists, even as their sort of center of gravity dissipated, you know, that you have this relationship between Bruce and Jay that continues and is even stronger in the 1970s, arguably, than it was in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, yes, I think I would agree with that.
I'd be curious too, just, I mean, you mentioned the New York beats, and allegedly she was there when Ginsberg first read Howl, but I don't actually know that much about DeFeo's relationship to poetry. And I don't know if any of you have more information, but I'd be kind of, you know, it's you can feel it in this exhibition too, but I just wonder if.
Well, she did have a poet write on you know, on the back of the eyes, Philip Lamantia, who was part of that scene, not as well known as some of the others, but at the time was. And, you know, so there was, of course, she was living in the same building with Michael McClure. So I think that there was a very fluid relationship between her and the poets. Do we have questions that maybe we should address at this point, Nick?
Sure. Well, I want to thank you all firstly for this wonderful conversation, and to everyone that has joined us and shared questions in the chat. So let's just jump right into it. First, I'm going to pass the mic over to our good friend G.E. Schwartz. G.E., you should be able to turn on your mic.
Thank you. I had several questions, but the one that the most recent one that I put in the chat that and thank you for this, because both of these artists have been so much to me for many, many years. For Conner, I've always wondered what, and other people that work in the way that he works in different ways, I wonder what the underlying motivation or propulsion was for both assemblage and collaboration, because it seems like there's some connections there that I don't quite understand, but I feel innately, and were there with him, and where did that come from? Thank you.
I can address this sort of sideways, I guess. I think that for Conner, one of his great subjects, things that really obsessed and interested him, was artistic identity, whether it's artistic identity as expressed in his work. For example, if I can use this art historical term, the very expressive assemblages, or his artistic identity in the works where he disappeared himself as an artwork. So that's a very important part of what's going on. Equally important, though, with assemblage is this knotty problem of art and life, which seems to be the kind of 20th century problem to beat all problems. And one of the ways to address the problem was through the collection and utilization of talismanic objects that you might find, say, for example, in the ruins of a neighborhood that should not have been torn down in the first place, or in the torn stockings and negligees of women, then repurposed as a kind of a comment and or protest on the exploitation of women. Or finally, with the way that Bruce Conner used some of his sculptural objects, like the protest that the anti-nuclear protests that he used the child for example. And all of these things are that sort of connection with community. But the kind of connection with community that you see it like food, somebody was mentioning the New York in the 70s and the collaborative quality of downtown New York. I completely agree. It wasn't my comments before weren't about that not happening. It's just that the art world of 57th Street was what Conner and Joan Brown and Jay Defeo had some gimlet eye about. But that kind of community is just, it's a different kind of collaboration. You don't see, unless I'm mistaken. I actually have a question for Rachel. Rachel, the project that Conner did when he was a teacher using his fingerprints, did he do that with somebody else, or was that just him? Do you remember?
No, that was just him. That was also just him when it's also in the Paula Cooper show.
Right.
And yeah, that was also just him. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, Conner, he really wasn't much of a collaborator. I mean, I think Edmund Shea is the prime exception. And I think that's why his relationship with Defeo is actually so illuminating to see this, because they didn't collaborate on, there's not a work that's authored by Bruce Conner and Jay Defeo, right? But they did collaborate in sort of off-kilter ways, and I think maybe that's why this hasn't been examined much before, because it's sort of to the side, it's like you look at the Jay Defeo photograph and all of a sudden you notice that there's this Bruce Conner print in it, but it's almost like if you're not looking for it, you might not notice. So I think it's really great to shine a light on this.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, GE, and thank you, Laura and Rachel. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to Thomas. Thomas, you should be able to turn on your mic now. Let's give him a moment. Okay, well, while we wait for Thomas's mic to turn on, I'm going to pass the mic now to Eric Teese. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. But Eric, you can turn on your mic now.
Well, thanks. I didn't really have a question. I'll just talk about Conner, collaborating. I thought about the work he did with Canyon Cinema, which, is a early and still existent distributor of experimental film in San Francisco. And he was on the board, and, there were some tumultuous things that happened over the year, but he put a lot of energy into that, making things possible for other people.
That's true. I remember as I was going through the archive, there was tons of correspondence related to Canyon Cinema, and it was. I think it broke his heart a little bit sometimes, but he was so invested in that endeavor.
He talked about the homelessness of the moving image, as this kind of crisis, and that he would always try to find ways to champion, certainly filmmaking itself, but Canyon Cinema was absolutely like a monument to his support of that community, but it also didn't end so well. but at least for a while, it worked.
Well, thank you. I can see that Thomas, his mic isn't working, so I'm going to read his question on his behalf. Thomas shared, angels, of course, are an enduring icon in Christian art history, but today one is reminded of Paul Klee's Angelus Novus and the nod Benjamin gave in his late life essay, Theses on the Philosophy of History, describing it as the last angel of history. Is there any evidence that this angel series is at least in part referencing Klee and Benjamin?
Not to my knowledge.
Not to my knowledge.
Not to my knowledge either.
I love direct answers. Excellent. Thank you so much.
But it's a nice thought.
Yes.
It is. I mean, I think the angels, like so much of Conner's work, were born of his own identity crises, that he experienced throughout his career. And he had a knack for making incredible, powerful art out of these moments of crisis. And I think that's really what the angels are. And as I mentioned in the essay, Bill Berkson has this incredible description of the angels as self-portraits in a time of crisis. And I think that that's a really apt description of that body of work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Christina, I'm going to pass you the mic now. You should see a prompt to turn on your mic.
Okay. Well, I feel a little out of my depth on this kind of the history of Jay, or biographical history of Jay. after the Rose left the apartment. And I was thinking, as there had been this focus in a way on that Stuart was making about Bruce's regard for or imbrication with women artists, I'm wondering if there's, I guess I have two implied parts to the question. One is, it just, do you think, is there any evidence or has anyone speculated on the possibility that Bruce was fascinated by Jay because of her kind of monolithic obsession with the Rose and then her abandonment of practice itself? Those two things together would have been fascinating to Bruce. And at the same time, the second part really of my question that I was mulling over is, does Jay herself have an interest in the complication of disappearance and seduction? As I think I would say that Bruce does, but does Jay have that too? So that's really two connected questions, not very well formed. They're just kind of mood questions. That's it.
Who would like to address that?
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
Just speculation, unfortunately.
Can we maybe invite Leah? Leah, do you have a comment about Jay Defeo? Leah Levy, or no? I don't mean to call you out.
Okay. First of all, this has been just a terrific and fascinating conversation. Thank you to everybody. I'm not sure, and I think rather than maybe focusing on that particular question of Christina's, a couple of other things come to mind. They were really good friends, and as much and as important as their work was to each other, and this riff in their work that the show is about and that continues to be fascinating, they were also very good friends and very kind to each other. So as difficult as we all know that Bruce could be, he could also be extraordinarily kind. I remember when we published the book in 2003, Jay Defeo and the Rose, fearing that he wouldn't let us use stills from the film, we used in the book some Polaroids that had been in Defeo's studio. And I remember exactly where I was when he called me and said, "Why didn't you ask me for stills from the film?" And there are many incidences like that where Bruce really extended himself. Another anecdote that might be interesting is that Jay Defeo told me that the part of the film, The White Rose, where she is rolling on the wrapped painting, that she was there because Bruce asked her to do it. Bruce told me that he walked into the room and she was doing it. So, you know, history is fluid. And I think that one of the things I appreciate the most about this conversation is how everyone is embracing the contradictions. So thank you for that. In terms of Jay not working for a period of about 3 years, from 66 to 69, I think she was just exhausted, and that's what she says. But I also think that when she began to work was when the Rose was first shown. So people's mentioning about the relationship of her resuming work once the Rose was well, not conserved, but out in the world again, at least for a period in 1969, was important to her. And without a doubt, Bruce's support of conservation of the Rose in the 70s was also a huge support for her.
Yeah, and he was very protective of Jay too, Leah. I remember when I was working on the show, the Jay Defeo show, he allowed me to come into his house and to go through all of his files in which he had correspondence with Jay, although he did hover over me and I had white gloves, and he had to make sure that none of the pages would be, you know, the order would be maintained in the files. But still in all, he wanted to make sure that I was able to really review that material, and helped me enormously.
I just wanted to quickly go back to the film itself, and I think Michelle Silva is on this Zoom, so I don't know if she wants to say anything about the restoration of the film, because really it's a heroic, groundbreaking effort. But I just wanted to mention too that, you know, for a long time, if you were an art historian, your only access to this work was a tiny black and white image, you know, which didn't convey at all the scale, the weight, the gravity, or the, you know, the environmental encounter, as well as what it looked like as an image. And that's what this film really accomplishes. Again, just, I mean, it's amazing how you're constantly cutting in and out and in and out, and it carves out the space. So it really does get back to the point that Rachel that makes so beautifully in her catalog essay about, you know, his interest in environments. And I noticed that Steph Katsias in the chat asks, another instance of Conner's collaborative endeavors that might be considered his work with the North American Ebers Chemical Company mounting light shows at the Avalon Ballroom in the late 1960s, a little outside the scope of this discussion, but still. You know, the light shows were really important, like very typical of that kind of California cultural moment, but again, it's just light and projection and in, you know, almost phantasmagoric situations were as important as objects or images to him. And so it does draw in, I think, a different understanding of the spiritual dimension of the work, but even somehow how he understood his relationships in these almost spectral ways. They weren't just people, they were almost like phantoms in his life, and, you know, the communication over the telephone as well as like in the actual space of Leo's studio. But there is just something so mystical about Conner, and, you know, I just think that this show's made me think about it in a slightly different way. But anyway, I don't know if Michelle wants to say anything about the restoration, but if she is here, maybe not.
Yeah, I just want to say, Michelle, we don't want to put you on the spot, but if you'd like to turn on your mic, you're more than welcome to. Maybe while Michelle considers, I selfishly have a question myself. It's kind of a very straightforward question, but there's one work in particular in the show I'm curious if you all could speak to. Perhaps this is open for everyone, but perhaps Stuart, if you have any thoughts on it. I'm going to pull it up now, but curious about the homage works, and in particular, this homage to Jean Harlow. I'm curious if you have any insights or any thoughts, kind of just in particular, this being a woman and kind of a Hollywood film star. Yeah, I'm leaving it open-ended if you have any observations on it.
You know, it's really interesting because also, I mean, the role that women play in the work is, you know, from the Jean Harlow piece to the Black Dahlia, you know, a lot of them are either glamorous stars or tragic murders, you know. I mean, you get, it is literally sunshine and noir, but this is a question that percolates throughout his career. It's not just, you know, and that's why I think you have to understand the relationship to Defeo within that context. And again, this is not something I've done any significant research on, but I think someone should. I mean, I really do think there's a dissertation that should be done on how Bruce engaged with women as media images, as friends, and, you know, the fact that Vivian and you know, Bruce and his wife Jean Conner even were also sort of entombed in that glass case at the Batman Gallery at one point. I mean, it extends to performances, but it comes up again and again and again. And it, you know, I don't think there's one way to read it, but I think it's a really important question for sure. And it's hard not to think too, in the case of the Jean Harlow piece, of somebody like Jack Smith, you know, who's coming at or even Warhol, coming at the question of Hollywood and the dream factory from these very almost sordid and abject points of view. But many of those artists were queer, and Conner was emphatically not. And, you know, yet the work itself is queer. You know, he was not, but there is something in the work that is. So those are, I don't know, some of the ways I might approach the question.
Thank you. Michelle, I do see that your mic is on if you'd like to share anything with us.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to speak. And I'm just trying to think of some details that maybe I have a tendency to get too technical, which is sometimes if you're not working in film or restoration, or an archivist can get a little bit too, you know, I noticed people start staring at the ceiling or that type of thing. Or so I think what I loved about working on this film is that it is so heartfelt and deeply personal and kind of melancholy. And working with this, I'll talk a little bit about the material. So we were able to go back to the camera original. So that's 16mm reversal. And we scanned that at 4K HDR using a Scanity, which is very delicate, especially for films that are very fragile like this. So from that, we work pretty exclusively with Photochem, and we've worked very hard to develop a relationship with them. And I think that over time, I don't know if anyone has ever worked on restoring a film, but there's many, many ways that it can go wrong. And so I think from start to finish, that laying out the workflow and how to get the best results is essential in kind of setting everything up, and also carefully respecting the tonality and also deciding what is original. I think that every film I have to ask that question, what is original? And with Bruce's films, that's really pretty tricky because he's working with a lot of found materials. You have to kind of decide, what scratch stays and which one remains. And is that supposed to be there? Are we destroying the integrity of the film? And I think, for something like a movie, you have to leave in some of the dirt. You have to leave in the crooked titles and these types of things that were essential to the experience. And so with this one in particular, I tried to focus mainly on making it pristine. The painting, the rose, and also Jay, I tried to clean up Jay's image and her face and herself as much as possible. And also the jumpsuits of the angelic hosts. So I had to focus a lot on them in particular. So you have to kind of decide an approach because it's kind of endless what you can do with film restoration, and you kind of have to decide an approach and parameters. But I think that we did a beautiful job, and the lab did an excellent job with kind of maintaining the beautiful tonality in the film. And I think the senior colorist from Photochem is on this talk also, so I have to thank him, Alastair Arnold. And also, the people within the labs. I mean, it's like, I'm orchestrating everything, but there's so many people who contribute to this work. And I think that, down to the people who are doing the dirt and scratch removal, there are some people who are operators and others who are artists. And I work very hard to find the artists within each lab. And I'm very happy with seeing it installed for the first time. So this has been a wonderful experience. So that's all I have to say, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
And I think it's just important to mention too that Michelle did actively work very closely with Bruce while he was still alive. And so she really has the advantage of not only having the technical know-how and the real dedication, but really firsthand experience with, talking in great depth with Bruce about his intentions, and also has allowed him to translate many of his works into the full-scale environments that he had hoped to achieve, such as Cosmic Ray becoming 3-screen Ray, for instance. But without Michelle, it's questionable whether Bruce could have really achieved that. So I just want to make sure she gets kudos.
Oh, thank you, Stuart.
Yes, I think Michelle might be one of the heroic Bruce Conner and elusive Bruce Conner collaborators, that we've been trying to think of, and she and Edmund Shea.
I will say that that Bruce was a great collaborator. I think that in the beginning, I did write a very short essay for the 70s catalog about making 3-screen Ray. And initially, I think when I first started working for Bruce, it was really, my only thought was to execute things to his satisfaction. That was my job, and his satisfaction, I'm trying to predict what he wanted, which means I had to be one step ahead of him, which actually was really hard. It was really difficult to do. I'd usually leave the house with headaches, because I had to, predict what Bruce would want before he would ask for it. And so I think that with him, with 3-screen Ray, he didn't really understand the depth of what digital tools were available to us to work within the home. And I think that was the only way that film got made, or that multi-channel piece, because he only used it as a tool to transfer things. He didn't use it as a creative tool. So I had the opportunity to show him, but I think telling him or expressing my opinion about one of his creative choices was something that was kind of terrifying the first time I did it. I thought, okay, I could get fired today. I could, this could be it. But it ended up kind of opening the door to him saying, I like your ideas. I'm going to use more of them. And I said, okay. So then that opened the door to us working, and we worked together very, very easily. And we had so much fun working on that. And I think I'll always cherish that time, that year that we spent. But I think we would go through each of the 3 panels, you know, looking at it simultaneously, going frame by frame and talking about the relationship and the juxtaposition of those images. And he would hand draw them out on a piece of paper, you know, like 24 frames, you know, and say, can you build this? Can you do this? And I'll cherish those memories always. But I felt like I was treated equally on that piece, where we would exchange ideas and he was open. So I think, yeah, I think he was a collaborator, but you had to earn his trust in a way.
Are there other questions, Nick?
Well, yes, I want to thank you, Michelle. And as you shared, also thank you to Alistair in the audience. Yes, well, we have our final question of the day coming from the Rail's very own Phong H. Bui. So Phong, you can turn your mic on now.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Connie, Rachel, and Laura. It's a very important gathering here. I'm so happy that we're able to find this date for this landmark show. It's a very important show that even some of us really familiar with the material, we just didn't see how it come together the way it did with these 2 opposite temperament, and how somehow they are deep friendship, which I can't help but to think when we published the great long interview with Bruce in 2006, I spoke to him and I remember he mentioned the 2 words he kept repeating. One is sardonic and the other one is sarcastic. Somehow it repeats throughout our conversation. And then, you know, I just realized that when I spoke to some Jonas makers about Conner, because, you know, Jonas have shown him early days when it was known as Cinematheque. And I know that Brackets too, who some of you remember first joined Cornell early film. It's early when he was 21 years old or 22, I can't remember. But the film was terrific. It's called Century of June. So that's probably made in the mid 50s or so. And I know when I spoke to Stan, he wanted to bring, he wanted to make the introduction between Conner and Cornell. And I wonder, Rachel, is there such existing correspondence between the 2 of them, or have been maybe just merely on the phone?
Between Conner and who?
Conner and
Cornell.
Yeah.
Oh, and Cornell. No, I don't think they ever corresponded, as far as I know.
I think it's apropos though, Phong, to bring up his friendship, however fleeting, it was real with Ray Johnson though.
Yes, that's true. It's, yes, you're absolutely right about that.
Another disappearing act.
Yeah, and that's the point. I mean, it's going back to Rachel referenced earlier about Bill Burks and Angel Beyond the Clay and Benjamin reference. And to the point, it's like he's never really wanted to make permanent object because he always felt like it's about decay and change. And so things can be disappear to his own liking is the key to understand some of the work. But I don't really have a particularly question except that follow up, you know, Connie's reference about beach poetry and how certain New York, you know, New York poets came and spent time in San Francisco. To be sure that he also had collaborated with Michael McClure, who he went to high school with in Kansas, the deck of cards. So I think that's one of the project that is a testament of that deep relationship with poets. So I just want to mention that. And thank you so much. Can't wait to see the show the third time. I went with Conner the other day, so it was terrific. So I thank you again, Rachel, Stuart, and Laura, and Connie. And we're going to sit back soon to hear our legendary poetry editor, Anselm Berrigan, read it. But back to you, Nikki. Thank you.
Thank you, Phong. And yeah, to that end, I will post in the chat once more. If you are in New York and have the pleasure of being able to go see the show, please do. It's open till October 23rd. And I wanted to, of course, thank everyone over at Paula Cooper Gallery for their help in making today's conversation possible. So thank you, everyone there. Before we do go to poetry, Connie or anyone, any last remarks or anything you want to share before we do move on? Or we're ready for poetry.
We're ready.
All right. Well, it
Always
is our
ready for poetry.
yes, especially here at the Rail. It is our tradition of ending all of our community events with a poetry reading, and I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, the Rail's very own Anselm Berrigan. Anselm is the poetry editor of the Rail. He lives and grew up in the somewhat lower part of Manhattan. He is the author of numerous books of poetry and chapbooks, most recently Pregrets, published this summer by Black Square Editions. So without further ado, Anselm, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna read from this book, Pregrets, which is just out. I just want to say it was really great to hear all of the talk and conversation about the show and the work. And I'm gonna go see the show tomorrow, actually, at the gallery. But I feel like I've learned a great deal about two people whose work I already have a ton of affection for. And Connie, we haven't seen each other in a long time, but it's really nice to be in the same forum with you. And I just lent Bill's selected poems to a friend of mine who I thought should be reading them all the time. And I just, to the Rail staff, thank you so much for everything you're doing. And Phong, Nick, Ty, and Anya for reading my poems. I sort of can't believe it, and it means quite a lot. This is a weird book. It's called Pregrets, and a lot of the poems are called Pregrets, but some are called Regrets, and some are called Degrets, and then there are these little sort of one-off variations on that. I got interested in writing underneath the word regrets because of the Jasper Johns show at MoMA, I think in 2014-ish, called Regrets. I sometimes like the idea of putting a word or a phrase at the top of a page and just sort of writing underneath it to see what kind of tone it gives me. And the Johns shows seem to have this sort of play on the word where there could be regret, but there could be humor in the sort of sense of regretting not being able to attend whatever horrible function you've invited me to or something like that. And then Pregrets came along and I thought, oh, this is like it just popped in my mind. I thought this is like getting ready to regret, right? And there's something very American about that, I thought at the time. And then Degrets was like a breakdown space. So I'd put the word at the top of the page and then kind of right underneath it off of some premise that I had. And that's where these poems came from. And I worked on them from 2014 to 2017, and it took a while for the book to happen. And John Yao got interested in it and did it for Black Square Editions, and I'm grateful for that. It's weird to be in 2021 and then read the poems written back then, but I think they work. I think there are assemblages that are also trying to be fluid, because at a certain point I was trying to figure out what a poem that would be a sculpture would be like, or if I could just stick a word to the page rather than write it. That was this sort of weird idea I had, but or maybe that's a very ordinary idea. Okay. I'm nervous. I'm going to read, okay, this is actually called Grets. Bound loom mount hang, tapes obsidian, arranger of corners cuddles space, pumice demands Jersey one, certain songs don't come on, error on the dial in love with, so I seem to be being instructed to peel off every layer of skin and gradually bleed out a map of personal extinction. But I do this, hopping rides on the backs of trash trucks, whole surfaces paid to self-invent, coming together to pull the present apart. I loathe metaphor. Autumn rhythms loathe me back, shooting past into a fear only the insane don't take for granted. Stiff, not stuff, arguably abstract, extended villain, sham shame, zone fallen, pivot skin, held dark, dark care, books, rooms. I read too fucking fast, but it works. Push low power mode on to pull time in the sandwich mode. As we get older, Dad gets funnier. My younger daughter possesses a version of his red-cheeked humor. Saying so makes me one of every son of a bitch who said he had rosy cheeks. His favorite band after he died was the Jungle Brothers. I'd love to never go on Sunday drives, even on weekdays. Take that, sane storage. We shines hold that. The we, the blue, and brush. You know death is scared of notation, right? And then this is actually called Deflate Grets, and it kind of comes out of reading an essay by the painter Rackstraw Downs called What Realism Means to Me, and then finding myself sitting in a playground writing this. Deflate Grets. We might as well start with the artificial hill on Governor's Isle. Or we might as well start with the way local street violence deflates the pompous, the pretentious, the grandiose dose of instant critical appraisal. No, we might as well begin with the neglect of certain experiences, pumpkin carving, say, due to tiny domestic compromises. Anywhere is a place to be for the Roach family. We might as well count bag leaves. They're banned in Paris. I see one shredded, I mean now, in a blank tree in Sour Park on 12th near B, where I write this amidst people, disguised as people, who don't kind of know me, maybe. The playground scene, a place where I'm getting a degree in performing what realism looks like it means to me. Sitting quietly between negotiations, i.e. 5-year-old June just handed some gum to me. I chewed it and handed it back, and she fled with horrified glee. Today we both hate the letter E. The gum competes with a browning yellow leaf for cheap mortality. And we might as well start with an overpriced cup of lukewarm coffee. We might as well start with the addict on the sea standing nearby smelling like Lower Manhattan in 1983. I fucked up today. This tiny little dude just came by to say hi to me anyway, not bringing the candy. And now Jay asks me to say my name, but I make her do it. Me and we no like that game. This is Pregrets. The page torn itself out on a plain line with a curve like the earth. Its destroyers too busy with reality's accreting encapsulation to notice, awed with interchangeable centers in fear of opposition. One too has having tremendous chaste desires to be slights. Don't insert your image thing there in that likeness, dug with reactionary vegetables. Pensive music sidles up to brackets. I've got your whole back, but you got no neck in my backpack requilibrium versus prequilibrium. Ahem, says Chip, circling the act of sequence. Pitch the shit or don't. There are many formaldehydes of anti-expression. Every 5 minutes, adding 5 years. Scale peers into traffic. Let us now misapprehend nature's inhospitable quality. Butterfly attacks. Private life goes on the wing. So this is like it pointing to itself or handing it to you, because it is the enigma. Right? I mean, it is it. You can't do anything with it. But this gets it right, puts it in your hand or in your voice. Yeah, it not only gives you it, but it gives you somebody giving you it, right? Which is like, it's up front in a way, whereas it is raining, is mystical, you know? It sure is, but it's also reality. I mean, it's real reality, whereas it's possible that you can't ever really say this when you mean it. There's a secret to that poem, but I'm not going to tell anybody today. And I'm just going to read one more. It's called Freegrets 3, and it's for and after Vivian Springford, the painter. And I wrote this actually because the Rail was involved with a show of Vivian Springford's 3 years ago or so. There was a sort of first show in a long time of the painter's work that had kind of been, you know, had disappeared, and Fong asked me to ask a few other people and myself to go to the gallery and sit and write something in relation to the work, and I felt quite moved by the work actually, and there's one moment in the poem, one phrase that's called, that goes 1984 seeds, seeings, change, and it's a phrase in the poem that does what it does, but in behind it, it's a reference to the fact that she was starting to have eye problems and losing her sight at that point. Freegrets 3. Frame shield forward bloom of a cosmic stain, up on the sun's old weird edge of expanse, to dispense with the bad news incubus service. Wayland calligraphy tipsy at the Capitol with Harry Smith film stills at off centers for imploded suckers phasing out of practice with attention. Shapes dispersed from a composed owl that ain't ever gonna think I'm an owl, cross-checking credibility's what nothing with flooding and frequent lightning. Original hatch buckles, portal to nebulae, improbably red lava beads playing at surfacing, burning grazes onto the enigma plane. Yellow looks out and up to the edge of a triple interior, a center obliterating perspective for Reformation's faint. We rhyme a lot, raises concerns. Top-down coloration shroom view, receding geography flake stains the way of the pixel back into the trail. That red sharpens the forward edge to make kindred forms estranged enough to signal themselves. 1984 seed seeings change, ghosts a speculate raining so hard the drops bounce multiply into rooms, heat fuzz pushing out of reference to authority. So as to desire being lost may require lost's permission. The desire to be lost brought forward by finding myself lost, untraining to project or training forever. Entraining the anti-project and anti-reflect in the intense heat's opening depth, remindered out at the frame's corner in an untitled Cosmos series, edges taking full extent as bleed. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Anselm, thank you so much. That was incredible. Thank you for all that you do. And I encourage everyone to please go get your copy of Freegrets. And once more, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Rachel, Laura, Connie, and Stuart. Also, a thank you to those in the audience that joined us, Michelle Silva, Lee Levy, Bruce Jenkins, and everyone. One more thanks to Paula Cooper Gallery, and also to Dermot Company for supporting this month of our new social environment. You can learn more about them and the Rail's curatorial projects through the links that we'll post in the chat in just a moment. And we host these conversations every day at 1 p.m. If you're available, join us on Monday for a conversation on abstractions in Chinese aesthetics and visual culture, featuring Johnson Chang, Pepe Carmel, Carol Yinghua Liu, and Paul Gladstone. To accommodate the varying time zones of our guests, that conversation will take place at 8 p.m. Eastern. But for now, I'm wishing you all a Shroom View weekend, and you can turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Anselm.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Rail.
Thank you. It was great.
Ciao.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Oh, happy Friday.
Bye from Canada.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hey, Anselm,
Hi,
it was
Shelley.
really
Hi.
good.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I tried.
Thanks, Alma.
See the show, you guys, and buy Anselm's book.
Yes.
Yes. For
Or
sure.
steal it. You can steal it too.
Sure. I think Jean Conner is here too, and I posted that
There's
she has a
Jean.
major show opening in the San Jose Museum next year. So see you all there.
Wonderful, Jean.
Thank you, Stuart.
Congratulations.
We love you.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you so much, you all. And have a great weekend.